Welcome back to Creepyverse. Before we begin tonight, I need you to do something for me. Lock your door, turn off the overhead light. Let only the screen illuminate the room around you. Because what you're about to hear didn't come from a fiction writer. It didn't come from someone trying to frighten you with invented shadows and borrowed scares. These stories came from the people who worked inside psychiatric hospitals. The nurses, orderlies, psychiatrists, social workers, architects, and security guards who spent their careers in facilities designed to house the most vulnerable among us. People who dedicated themselves to the careful, precise, utterly rational work of mental health care. And then something happened to them. Something that their training hadn't prepared them for. Something that their colleagues dismissed, their supervisors rationalized, and that official documentation either erased or quietly confirmed. 15 stories. 15 people who saw things they cannot explain. 15 accounts that begin with ordinary shifts, routine rounds, standard paperwork, and end somewhere that medicine has no language for. Some of them transferred to different facilities. Some requested different shifts. Some retired early, citing burnout or stress or the need for a change. None of them ever stopped thinking about what they witnessed. Stay with us, because by the time the 15th story ends, you're going to understand something important about hospitals, about the people inside them, about what it means to care for someone so completely that even death isn't reason enough to stop. This is Creepyverse, and these are the 15 psychiatric ward stories that will haunt you. Story 1, Room 33. I want you to picture a door. Standard institutional hardware. Safety glass window inset at eye level. Room number clearly marked in black digits on a white background. The kind of door you'd see behind you 100 times on any given night shift without really registering it. Just a door, just a room. Now picture that door at the very end of a long corridor. And picture the window, the one that should let you see inside, that exists specifically so nurses can perform their welfare checks without disturbing sleeping patients, covered from the inside, blacked out completely. Paper or cardboard pressed flat against the glass, so that no matter how close you lean, no matter which angle you choose, you see nothing. Just darkness where there should be visibility. That was room 33. I started at Clearwater Psychiatric Hospital in the autumn of 2003. Night shift, Ward A, 32 rooms arranged along a single corridor, the nursing station positioned at a midpoint that gave clear sightlines to both ends. The layout was deliberate. Everything about psychiatric facility design is deliberate. The angles, the distances, the placement of every fixture, it all exists in service of one principle, that the people responsible for patient welfare must always be able to see. Charge Nurse Martinez walked me through orientation on my first day. She was a woman of extraordinary calm, the kind of veteran nurse who had seen every variety of human distress so many times that nothing visibly unsettled her anymore. She moved through the ward with quiet authority, showing me medication schedules, documentation requirements, emergency protocols. The tour was thorough, methodical, professional. And then we reached the end of the corridor. She stopped at room 33. She did not reach for the door handle. She did not look through the blackened window. She simply stopped, turned to me with an expression that I would spend years trying to categorize and said, "Room 33 is not part of your duties. The door remains locked. Patients are not assigned to this room. If anyone asks about it, you direct them to administration." I remember the silence that followed. I remember noticing, even then, that the door's hinges were freshly painted, that the safety mechanisms looked recently serviced, that this was not, in any physical sense, a neglected storage room. "What's inside?" I asked. "Storage," Martinez said, and then she walked away. For my first 6 months, I accepted that answer. Clearwater kept me busy enough that room 33 was easy to set aside. 32 active patients required constant attention. Medication rounds, behavioral monitoring, documentation, the particular vigilance required when people in acute psychological distress are trying to sleep through their darkest hours. I had no shortage of things demanding my focus. But small details accumulated. The key ring at the nursing station held a key marked with the number 33. It sat between the keys for 32 and 34, as though it belonged there in the ordinary sequence of things, as though it was used as routinely as any other. When I asked the day nurse about it during my first solo shift, she shrugged without looking up from her chart. It's always been there. Never used it, never needed to. The freshness of room 33's maintenance nagged at me. Storage rooms don't get new paint on their hinges. Storage rooms don't have their lock mechanisms regularly serviced. I'd worked in enough institutional settings to know what genuine neglect looked like, and room 33 showed no signs of it. Whatever was being done to that room, it was being done with care. And then, sometime around my 3rd month, I heard the first sound. It was close to 3 in the morning, during that particular stillness that settles over a psychiatric ward in the deep hours, when the anxious patients have finally surrendered to sleep and the night feels almost peaceful. I was walking my rounds, passing room 33, when I heard something from behind the covered window. Not mechanical, not the settling of pipes or the hum of HVAC equipment or the various anonymous sounds that old buildings make when no one is around to investigate them. This was organic, a shifting weight, a soft, deliberate movement, the kind of sound that a person makes when they're trying to move quietly but can't quite manage it. I stopped, listened. The sound stopped too. I walked a few steps further down the corridor and waited. After about 20 seconds, the movement resumed. Slower this time, more careful, as though whatever was inside room 33 had heard my footsteps and was now listening to me just as carefully as I had been listening to it. I began noticing that the sounds were not random. They had timing, they had pattern. They responded to activity in the corridor. When I walked past room 33, the interior fell silent. When I moved away, the sounds resumed. When multiple staff members passed together during a rushed moment, the room went completely quiet. When I was alone and the ward was still, the sounds were at their most distinct. The patients noticed too, and their reactions were more disturbing than anything I'd observed directly. Patients in psychiatric facilities carry a kind of perception that's difficult to articulate. Their relationship to ordinary reality is already altered in ways their clinicians are still working to understand. But they are often acutely sensitive to environments, to presences, to the emotional texture of spaces in ways that the rest of us screen out. Ward A's patients told me things about room 33 without being asked. Most of them avoided the end of the corridor entirely. They would simply turn around before reaching it, as though an invisible line existed 15 feet from room 33's door. On the rare occasions when a patient did approach, usually the newer admissions who hadn't yet absorbed the ward's unspoken geography, they would stop at that invisible threshold, stand motionless for a long moment, and then turn around quickly without explanation. One evening, during medication distribution, I asked patient Morrison directly. He was standing near the end of the corridor, looking toward room 33's door. "What do you see when you look at that room?" I asked. He turned to me with a genuinely confused expression. "What room? The hallway ends at 32. He was looking directly at it. Door, number, blackened window, all of it plainly visible from where we both stood. And yet Morrison was telling me with complete sincerity that he couldn't see it. I wrote that down. I kept writing things down. In November, my 8th month at Clearwater, I made a decision that I've thought about almost every day since. It was close to 3 in the morning. The sounds from room 33 had been more frequent lately. Not just the soft shifting I'd grown accustomed to, but more deliberate impacts. Someone, pressing against the door from the inside. Not violent, almost rhythmic, as though someone was testing the resistance over and over again, patiently, persistently, with the methodical determination of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. I took the key marked 33 from the nursing station ring. I walked to the end of the corridor. My hands were steady. I was a nurse. I was trained for moments that required steadiness. The key went into the lock without resistance, turned smoothly. The mechanism disengaged cleanly, exactly as a properly maintained lock should. I reached for the door handle. It didn't move. Not locked, I just unlocked it. Not stuck in the ordinary sense of warped wood or humidity-swollen frames. The handle simply would not turn. It was as though it was welded in place, as though the concept of turning had been removed from it entirely. I tried with both hands. I applied my full weight. I tried the key again, withdrew it, tried once more. The lock engaged and disengaged without problem. The handle remained absolutely immobile. And then the alarm started. Not the ward alarm. Not the medical emergency signal I'd been trained to respond to. A different sound entirely, high-pitched, continuous, coming from inside room 33. And the covered window began to glow. Red light, pulsing in rhythm with the alarm, bleeding around the edges of the cardboard or paper blocking the glass. I ran back to the nursing station, checked the alarm panel, all systems normal, all indicators green. No alerts, no emergency signals, no evidence that any alarm anywhere in the building had activated. The sound from room 33 continued for exactly 17 minutes. I know because I sat at the nursing station with my eyes on the clock, counting, willing myself to breathe evenly, telling myself there was an explanation. At the 17-minute mark, the sound stopped. The red glow faded. The corridor returned to its ordinary nighttime stillness. In the morning, I reported it to Martinez. She walked with me to room 33, tried the key herself, confirmed the lock was operational and the handle was immovable. "I'll contact maintenance," she said, in a tone that suggested she was doing me a courtesy rather than addressing a genuine concern. 3 weeks passed. No maintenance response. The sounds continued, growing more distinct. By December, I could identify specific patterns with uncomfortable precision. Pacing, the weight shifting of someone who walks because staying still is unbearable. Impacts that sounded like a hand or shoulder against the door. And something else. Something I had the hardest time writing in my incident reports. Something that sounded in the deepest hours of the night when the ward was completely quiet, like voices. Too muffled to understand, but rhythmic, conversational, as though two people were speaking quietly, carefully, aware that they might be overheard. On December 18th, I found patient Davis standing at room 33's door at 2 in the morning. He was standing completely still, facing the blackened window, arms at his sides. "Mr. Davis, you should be in your room." He didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned, his expression was something I had never seen on him before. Profound sadness, yes, but also a kind of recognition, as though he was confirming something he had suspected for a long time. "She's asking for help," he said quietly. "Every night, she asks for help." "Who is?" "The nurse behind the door. She's been there so long." I guided him back to his room. But over the following week, I positioned myself to observe room 33 without being obvious. 3 separate patients approached the door on different nights. Davis, Mrs. Henderson from room 19, Mr. Rodriguez from room 8. Each stood motionless for several minutes. Each left looking disturbed in a way that was distinct from their ordinary clinical presentation. I asked Mrs. Henderson what she heard. Without hesitation, she said, "Crying. Someone crying for help." I couldn't hear it, but that night, I pressed a stethoscope against room 33's door. Through the metal, clearly, terrifyingly clearly, I heard a woman's voice. Not muffled the way sounds through a door should be muffled, startlingly clear, saying one word over and over in a tone that contained exhaustion and desperation in equal measure. "Please." I jerked back. The stethoscope hit the floor. The voice stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than silence should. On January 3rd, I arrived for my shift to find 2 maintenance workers at room 33 under Martinez's supervision, not responding to the maintenance request I'd filed, not investigating the alarm or the handle or the sounds. They were removing the door handle entirely, dismantling the mechanism, leaving only a smooth metal plate where the hardware had been. Room 33 now had no external means of opening. Just a keyhole and a door that would never move from the outside again. "Security modification," one of the workers said when I asked. "Rooms being converted to permanent storage." When I checked with day shift the next morning, no one had been informed about the modification. No work orders had been filed. No security changes had been scheduled through any official channel. Yet room 33 now had no handle. The sound stopped completely after that. No movement, no impacts, no voices, just silence. Permanent, sealed, absolute silence. I transferred to day shift in February, citing schedule conflicts. I never went back to nights. But sometimes, during quiet moments on day shift, I walk to the end of Ward A's corridor. Room 33 is still there. Door still locked, window still covered from inside. And sometimes I see patients standing at the end of the hall, perfectly still, facing a door that has no handle, listening to something I can no longer hear. Some doors, I've learned, are not locked to keep people out. They're locked to keep something in. And some things inside them have been asking for help for a very long time. Story 2. Two of the same man. There is a diagnosis called Capgras syndrome. It is named for the French psychiatrist who first described it in 1923, and it involves a specific and devastating delusion, the belief that someone close to you, a loved one, a spouse, a parent, has been replaced by an identical imposter. The face is the same. The voice is the same. Every mannerism, every memory, every physical detail is perfectly replicated, but the person in front of you is not real. Something has substituted itself for the person you love, and only you can see it. Capgras syndrome is genuinely terrible. I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened at Valley State, because the horror of this story is built on something real, something clinically documented, something we know exists and have treatment protocols for. What happened with David Kellerman had nothing to do with Capgras syndrome. Or perhaps it had everything to do with it. I admitted David Kellerman on September 15, 2019. He was 34 years old, brought in by police following a public disturbance. He had been standing outside his apartment building, demanding that officers arrest what he called my replacement. Another man with his face who, according to Kellerman, had assumed his identity, moved into his home, taken his job, and inserted himself into all of his relationships. During our initial intake session, Kellerman was coherent, calm, and absolutely convinced of what he was telling me. He described coming home from work to find another version of himself sitting at his kitchen table, wearing his clothes, speaking in his voice. The other man had looked at him with an expression of mild irritation and told him, "You're the fake one. I think you should leave." Kellerman fled the apartment. He spent 3 days trying to convince various authorities that someone had stolen his identity in a way that went beyond fraud, beyond impersonation, beyond anything the law had categories for. When no one believed him, his behavior escalated to the level that prompted police involvement and his psychiatric admission. I diagnosed him with acute paranoid delusions with possible identity confusion. We began treatment antipsychotic medication, daily therapy sessions, careful reality testing. Kellerman was cooperative but persistent. He did not accept his diagnosis. He was, I noted in my records, a patient who experiences his delusions with the absolute conviction of lived reality. That phrase, which I had used in dozens of previous case files, would take on a meaning I hadn't intended. 18 days after Kellerman's admission, I received a call from our admissions department. Police were bringing in another psychiatric emergency. A man who had presented at a downtown precinct insisting that someone had stolen his identity and was currently receiving psychiatric treatment under his name at our facility. He knew the facility's name. He knew the treating physician's name. He was demanding to see whoever was being treated as David Kellerman because that person was an imposter. His name, according to the identification he provided, was David Kellerman, age 34, same photograph on the driver's license, same social security number, same emergency contacts, same address, the apartment from which our original patient claimed to have been expelled. I assumed this was a family member who had become entangled in Kellerman's delusions. It happens. Psychiatric illness can draw people close to the patient into its narrative gravity, particularly when the delusional content is elaborate and internally consistent. I proceeded to the intake evaluation, expecting to find a distressed relative, perhaps a brother or a cousin who resembled the patient closely enough to have been recruited into the story. The man who sat across from me in the intake room was identical to my patient in every observable detail. Same height, same weight, same facial structure, same hairline, same voice. He answered my intake questions with complete composure, providing a personal history that matched David Kellerman's documented background point for point. Childhood memories, educational history, work experience, the names of family members, details about relationships and friendships, all of it perfectly consistent with the original Kellerman's file. When I examined him, I found the same appendectomy scar in the same location, the same childhood injury to the left hand, the same distinctive birthmark on the left shoulder. Medical examination, fingerprint analysis, dental record comparison, DNA sampling. We ran every test available. The results came back 10 days later. Both men had identical fingerprints. Both matched the dental records on file for David Kellerman. Both possessed every identifying mark in the same location. The DNA samples, processed by an independent laboratory, showed identical genetic markers, not similar, not a close familial match, but identical, as though the same person had been tested twice. In 17 years of psychiatric practice, across over 800 patient cases, I had never encountered anything that required me to question the fundamental assumption that each human body is singular, that one person produces one fingerprint, one DNA profile, one reflection in the world. David Kellerman had undermined that assumption completely. We kept the two men separated and began referring to them, for administrative purposes, as Kellerman A and Kellerman B. Both objected strenuously to any designation that implied they were not the original. Both insisted the other was an imposter who had somehow achieved perfect biological replication of their person. Both were terrified. In therapy sessions, I attempted to find psychological differences that might reveal which man was experiencing delusions, personality patterns, emotional response styles, memory construction, intellectual characteristics. There was nothing. Both men demonstrated identical cognitive profiles. Both had the same emotional response to the same therapeutic prompts. Both constructed memories in the same way, with the same gaps, the same emphases, the same moments of unexpected clarity and unexpected blankness. And then they began to synchronize in ways that made my hands shake when I wrote the case notes. When Kellerman A showed improvement in reality testing on a Tuesday, Kellerman B showed identical improvement on the same Tuesday. When one experienced a medication side effect, agitation, sleep disruption, appetite changes, the other manifested the same symptoms within hours. Treatment adjustments made for one patient produced identical results in the other, as though they shared a single nervous system that we were accessing from two different points. On November 2nd, I made what I now believe was a serious mistake. I arranged a controlled meeting between the two men. My reasoning was clinical. Sometimes direct confrontation with the object of a delusion forces a breaking point that allows reality testing to function properly. If one of these men was psychotic, seeing the other face-to-face might create the cognitive dissonance necessary to begin unraveling the delusion. I had 3 staff members present, emergency protocols in place, sedation prepared. Both men entered the conference room from opposite doors simultaneously. They saw each other clearly for the first time since admission. The reaction was immediate and absolute. Both began screaming at the same instant, in the same pitch, in perfectly synchronized terror. Not the confused, uncertain alarm of a person seeing someone who resembles them. The specific, primal horror of someone confronting their own reflection in an impossible context. "That's me," both men said, simultaneously, in the same voice, with the same inflection. Both collapsed within 30 seconds. Acute psychological shock. We sedated them, returned them to separate rooms, monitored them through the night. They recovered physically within hours, but their condition had deteriorated past anything I could address with existing treatment protocols. Kellerman A began whispering something during our next session that I have never been able to stop hearing. "Doctor," he said, "what if we're both real? What if somehow there are 2 of me and neither of us is fake?" On November 8th, I arrived at the hospital to find one David Kellerman in our records. Not discharged, not transferred, simply one patient where there had been 2 the previous day. Room 247, where Kellerman B had been housed, was empty. Not just unoccupied, its occupancy appeared never to have occurred. Bed made, surfaces clean, no personal effects, no documentation trail. I checked the medical files. One admission record for David Kellerman, dated September 15th. One set of treatment notes. One patient. My own detailed case notes documenting both patients, their parallel symptoms, the failed meeting, the matching DNA results, all of it present in my personal records, none of it reflected anywhere in the official hospital system. I went to nursing staff. No one remembered treating a second Kellerman. The room assignment logs showed 247 vacant for weeks. Security footage from the period when both patients were present showed only one David Kellerman in our facility. But my notes, my photographs, my handwritten documentation from 73 days of treating 2 identical men, all of it still there. All of it preserved in my personal files, describing events that had apparently not occurred according to every official source I could access. The remaining patient, Kellerman A, or perhaps Kellerman B, or perhaps the only David Kellerman who had ever existed, improved steadily and was discharged 3 weeks later. He showed no memory of there ever being another version of himself. His delusions officially had resolved. He was ready, clinically and administratively, to return to his life. I watched him leave the facility. He walked through the lobby with the steady confidence of a man who has recovered from something that tried to take him apart. He pushed through the exit door and stepped into the grey November afternoon. And just before the door swung closed behind him, he looked back at the lobby, at the chairs and the check-in desk and the corridor that led to the treatment wings. His eyes moved across the space slowly, scanning, searching, the way you'd look for something you expected to see and couldn't find. Something that should have been there. Something that was there once and now wasn't. He held that expression for 3 seconds. Then the door closed and he was gone. Some patients recover from their delusions by integrating impossible experiences into a version of reality that can accommodate only one of them. And some medical cases close with documentation that tells two completely different stories, one in the official record and one in the handwriting of a physician who knows what she saw. Story 3. The VOICES in the ceiling. I want to be clear about something before I tell you this. I was not a superstitious person. I did not go looking for this. I'm a man who spent 7 years doing physically demanding, emotionally draining, deeply unglamorous work in a psychiatric facility because I believed in the importance of that work. I mopped floors, transporting patients in wheelchairs, restrained people in crisis, cleaned rooms that I prefer not to describe. I was practical. I was grounded. I believed in what I could see and touch and document. I tell you this because I need you to understand that when I say I heard voices coming from the ceiling, I am not speaking metaphorically. I am not describing a psychological episode. I am not reaching for drama. I heard voices in the ceiling of Riverside Psychiatric Institute for 4 months. And then the ceiling started giving better medical advice than some of the doctors. Riverside's ventilation system was original to the building, installed in the 1970s with updates in the 1990s. Large metal ducts running through the ceiling spaces, carrying conditioned air between floors and wings. Old but functional, maintained adequately, producing the ordinary industrial sounds that become background noise after your first week in the building. You stop hearing them the way you stop hearing the hum of your own refrigerator. During my first year, this was all the ventilation system was to me: background. In March 2018, the background started talking. I noticed it first during my 2 a.m. rounds, when the facility was at its quietest and every sound carried further than it should. Voices filtering down through the ceiling vents. Not random noise, resolving into something language-like, the way running water can sound like whispered conversation, or wind can sound like someone calling your name. These were clear, deliberate, structured exchanges, the measured cadence of professional consultation. 2 voices, sometimes 3, discussing matters with the careful specificity of people who understood exactly what they were talking about. I mentioned it to my supervisor. He explained it easily. In old institutional buildings, sound travels through connected ductwork from other areas of the facility. Late-night administrative work, overnight staffing discussions, conversations happening several floors away could filter through the system and become audible in distant locations. Distorted by distance, garbled by the duct geometry, but still recognizable as speech. I accepted this. I continued my rounds. I tried to stop listening. But you can only successfully ignore something until it says a patient's name. In April, during my 2 a.m. walk, I heard something distinctly from the vent above the nursing station on my ward. Clear enough that I stopped walking and stood directly beneath it. Medication adjustment for room 23. Increased dosage. Monitor for side effects. Room 23 housed Mrs. Patterson. She'd been having ongoing issues with medication compliance, refusing her evening doses, complaining about the existing regimen, resisting the nursing staff's attempts to address the problem. I knew her case from the handover conversations I'd overheard during shift changes. The next morning, I checked her chart out of a curiosity I couldn't quite justify. New orders, medication increase, exact parameters matching what I'd heard in the ceiling. I told myself it was coincidence. Medication adjustments are common in psychiatric facilities. Patients get their dosages changed routinely. The ceiling had said something vague. I had filled in details from my existing knowledge of the case, and the two had aligned in a way that felt meaningful because the human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns it wants to find. I believed this for about 2 weeks. Then I heard, Room 17 requires psychiatric evaluation. History of self-harm. Monitor closely. Room 17 housed Mr. Chen. He had been admitted for depression, standard presentation, no documented history of self-harm, no indicators of immediate risk. He was a quiet man who participated cooperatively in his treatment. Nothing in his presentation had suggested the kind of acute concern the voice was describing. The following day, his chart contained new notations about self-harm risk and increased observation protocols. I started keeping a log, a personal notebook that I carried in my breast pocket during night shifts. Every time I heard something from the ceiling vents that was specific enough to verify, I wrote it down. Time, location, content. Then I'd check the charts in the morning and document whether the recommendation had been implemented. The correlation, over 6 weeks of systematic tracking, was 100%. Every specific clinical recommendation I heard through the ventilation system was implemented in patient care within hours or days of my hearing it. Not approximately, not in rough outline. The exact medication, the exact evaluation, the exact monitoring protocol, all of it appearing in official records as though it had been ordered through proper channels by authorized medical personnel. I tried to trace the source. I walked the ductwork routes as best I could from the outside, identifying where the sound would logically originate based on the building's layout. The conversations were occurring during night hours, in locations where no staff were working, using knowledge of patient conditions that would require access to current medical records. There was no physical explanation for how the consultations were being conducted or who was conducting them. And then, in May, the patients started talking back. During my 2 a.m. rounds, I found Mr. Williams standing in his room, looking at the ceiling vent, speaking in the measured tone of someone engaged in a serious conversation with a person they respect. "Yes, doctor, I understand the new medication schedule, twice daily with meals." There was no one on the other end of this conversation that I could hear. The vent was silent, at least to me. But Williams was clearly receiving information, processing it, asking follow-up questions, and receiving answers that I couldn't detect. "Mr. Williams, who are you talking to?" He looked at me with an expression of mild surprise at the interruption. "The doctor. He's explaining my treatment changes through the speaker system." "There's no speaker system in patient rooms, Mr. Williams." He looked at me for a moment with something close to pity. "Of course there is. It's in the ceiling." The next morning, his chart showed new medication orders. Twice daily dosing with meals. Exactly what he had described receiving from the invisible voice in his ceiling. Over the following weeks, more patients reported similar experiences. They were receiving detailed medical consultations through sources that didn't exist, getting information about their conditions and treatment plans that proved accurate, engaging in conversations with medical professionals who apparently worked exclusively in the spaces between the floor above and the ceiling below. "The voice knows everything about me," Mrs. Garcia told me. "My history, my symptoms, my family situation, better than any doctor I've talked to in person." I checked whether the voices were simply providing general reassurance that patients were interpreting as specific medical information. They were not. Patient accounts of their ceiling consultations predicted chart changes with the same accuracy as my own overheard fragments. Something was conducting proper medical consultations with our patients through channels that should not have been able to carry that content. In June, I decided to investigate the ventilation system from the inside. I accessed the ceiling space through a maintenance panel, brought a flashlight and an audio recorder, and spent an uncomfortable 40 minutes crawling through the ductwork above the ward. The ceiling space was exactly what you'd expect in a 70-year-old institutional building. Metal ducts, insulation, electrical conduits, structural beams, no equipment, no speakers, no microphones, no hidden communication infrastructure of any kind. And yet, moving through that space, I could hear the voices, clearly, directly around me, close enough that I should have been able to reach out and touch whoever was speaking. Detailed medical discussions about patients throughout the facility, specific names, specific conditions, specific treatment recommendations. I followed them through the ductwork, moving toward the sound, and they moved ahead of me, always just beyond where my flashlight reached. I could not identify their source because they had no fixed location. The sound shifted independently through the duct system, as though it was being generated by something that could move through solid metal without regard for physical constraints. I played the recording back at the nursing station the next morning. My movements through the ceiling space were clearly audible. The sound of my breathing, my position adjustments, the scrape of my elbows on the metal. No voices. Not a syllable of the extended medical consultations I had heard clearly during the 40 minutes I was recording. The chief engineer agreed to inspect the ventilation system. He found nothing unusual. He did, however, make one modification at my request. He sealed several vent openings in patient rooms using industrial adhesive and heavy-duty covers. Permanent closure of the access points that patients had reported as the source of their consultations. The sealed vents had no effect whatsoever on the voices. Patients continued reporting detailed medical consultations from ceiling locations where the ductwork had been completely blocked. The recommendations continued appearing in official patient records. On July 23rd, during my 4 a.m. rounds, I heard my own name. Orderly Rodriguez requires rest rotation. Excessive overtime stress indicators. Recommend schedule modification. The following week, my supervisor called me into his office and adjusted my work schedule. He cited concern about overtime hours. He said it was routine staff wellness protocol. He said the decision had come from administration. He said he'd made the call himself. I transferred to day shift in August. I cited family reasons, which was partially true. But the real reason was that I was afraid. Afraid of what it meant that something in the spaces between floors was watching. Watching patients, watching their treatment, watching their recovery. Watching me and finding me tired and deciding I needed rest. Afraid of the fact that whatever it wasn't wrong. Some buildings develop their own approaches to patient care. They use communication systems that exist independently of anything installed by human hands. And some treatment decisions are made by consultants who work in the spaces between what's officially documented and what actually heals people. I don't know if what I heard was good or something terrible wearing the mask of good. I only know that the patients under its care received accurate, appropriate, clinically effective medical guidance from voices that had no physical mechanism to exist. And that sometimes, during quiet moments even now, I hear something in whatever ceiling I happen to be standing beneath, and I wonder if it's still working, still watching, still making its rounds in the space above the world where people like me spend their days. Story 4. The shift report THAT wrote itself. Shift reports are the foundation of psychiatric nursing. I want you to understand this before everything else, because the significance of what happened depends entirely on understanding that the shift report is not bureaucratic paperwork. It is not a formality. It is not a box to be checked at the end of a long day. The shift report is the handover of responsibility for 20, 30, 40 human lives. It is the document that tells the incoming nurse, this person refused their medication and you need to know why. This person's family called and the conversation was difficult. This person showed signs of escalating distress during the afternoon and requires close monitoring tonight. Without accurate shift reports, Psychiatric nursing is flying blind over terrain where the consequences of error are people in crisis with no one adequately prepared to help them. I wrote shift reports for 14 years with the care and precision that responsibility deserves. I did not cut corners. I did not leave things out. I did not hand over a ward without making sure the incoming nurse understood every person in her care. On October 14th, 2020, I completed the most thorough shift report of my career. And then it disappeared. And then it came back. And then it was different from the one I had written. And then I found out who had changed it. 23 patients on our ward that evening. I spent 45 minutes on the written documentation, reviewing each room, consulting my notes from rounds, ensuring that every observation worth recording was clearly described. Room 12. Mr. Patterson, increased agitation. Dr. Martinez wants hourly overnight observations. Room 18. Mrs. Chen, refused evening medication. Dizziness complaints requiring morning follow-up with Dr. Williams. Room 23. Family visit today. Daughter concerned about increased confusion. Cognitive assessment recommended. I went through all 23 patients. It was thorough. It was complete. It was exactly what night shift nurse Jennifer Thompson needed to step into that ward and care for those people safely. The handover meeting at 11 p.m. went normally. Thompson asked good questions, took notes, confirmed her understanding of the priorities. We went through every patient together. She was ready. 15 minutes after we finished, she called back to tell me my written report wasn't on the clipboard. I had left it in the standard location. I always left it in the standard location. It had been there when we met for handover. I'd been holding it. But the clipboard, when Thompson went to retrieve it after our verbal session, was empty. Blank forms only. We searched everywhere it could conceivably have been placed. Nursing station, medication room, patient chart area, even the break room. Nothing. Work from the patient charts, I told Thompson. Everything important should be recorded in the individual records. But when she began her rounds, she found something far worse than missing paperwork. 3 patient rooms were empty, not merely unoccupied, empty of evidence that anyone had ever been assigned to them. Room 12, bed stripped to the mattress, medical equipment removed, space prepared for deep cleaning. Room 18, no personal items, no family photographs, nothing of Mrs. Chen's presence. Room 23, vacant, no trace of occupancy. According to official records, those rooms had been unoccupied for weeks. According to official records, there were no patients named Patterson, Chen, or anyone resembling the cognitive decline patient I had been treating in room 23. According to official records, I had provided handover information about people who did not exist. I came in the next morning unable to sleep, and I went through every possible avenue. My personal notes, nothing about those 3 patients. My medication administration records, no entries for any patient in rooms 12, 18, or 23. My assignment sheets, blank for those rooms. Yet I had clear, specific memories of caring for Mr. Patterson, of his agitation during afternoon rounds, of the particular way he paced his room when the paranoid thoughts accelerated, of Mrs. Chen's frustration with her medication, her careful articulation of the dizziness that was making her refuse the pills, of the woman in room 23 whose daughter had sat with her for 2 hours and left looking frightened. I remembered their faces. I remembered our conversations. I remembered the texture of caring for them. And Thompson remembered the handover. She had her notes from our meeting, written in her own hand. During the conversation, specific details about 3 patients who apparently had never been admitted to our facility. We were not both confused. We were not both misremembering. 2 separate people had independent documentation of a shift report meeting, in which 3 non-existent patients were discussed in specific clinical detail. 5 days later, on October 19th, I found my shift report. Right where I had left it, on the clipboard at the nursing station, clearly marked with the date and shift information, exactly where it should have been and wasn't. I picked it up and began reading through it, preparing to file it properly. And then I saw the additional entries. At the bottom of my documentation, below my final patient notes, in a section of the page that I had left blank, 3 lines of writing. Different ink, different handwriting. Neat, professional, composed. The handwriting of someone accustomed to clinical documentation. Room 12, Patterson Robert, discharged to family care. 10:14, 11:30 p.m. Room 18, Chen Margaret, transferred to medical unit. 10:14, 11:45 p.m. Room 23, Thompson Dorothy, expired. 10:15, 12:03 a.m. I read those 3 lines 4 times. I know because I counted. Trying to make the words say something different from what they said. Trying to find an explanation that would allow me to remain standing without holding the edge of the nursing station for support. Patterson hadn't been discharged to family care. He had been showing signs of acute agitation that made him unsuitable for discharge. Chen hadn't been transferred. She was stable, awaiting a medication consultation. And I had no patient named Dorothy Thompson in room 23. No one named Thompson had been admitted to our facility during the recent weeks. Yet the notes described their outcomes as precisely and clinically as any authorized discharge documentation I had ever written. At the bottom, a signature, Thompson L.R.N. Jennifer Thompson's first name is Jennifer. She had not signed the report. She had never seen it. I had our staffing records checked for any nurse named L. Thompson. There was one reference. Linda Thompson, R.N., who had served as night shift supervisor at Pinewood from 1987 to 1989. She had died in a car accident in 1990. 30 years before the entries bearing her name appeared in my handwriting, in her handwriting, at the bottom of a shift report that had vanished and returned without explanation. I kept photocopies. I preserved them in a sealed folder that I have kept in the same location for 5 years now. Evidence of documentation that appeared, lingered for 3 days while both Thompson and I could read it clearly, and then faded from the original pages until only my handwriting remained. Since that October, I find additional entries in my shift reports occasionally. Outcomes for patients, written in handwriting I don't recognize, signed by nursing staff who are no longer employed, staff who are no longer alive. Outcomes that, when I've investigated, prove accurate. Patients who received the care they needed. Crises that were averted. Transitions that were handled with a competence and compassion that makes me, professionally, grateful, even though I cannot account for who provided it. Some shift reports, I have come to understand, continue being updated by nurses whose sense of duty was not diminished by the practical matter of their deaths. Some of the best patient care I have seen documented at Pinewood has been signed by a woman who died 3 decades before I arrived. I have stopped questioning it. I simply make sure my own entries are thorough enough that whoever is continuing my work in the hours I'm not present has everything they need to do it properly. It is the least I can do for a colleague. Story 5. The room that kept growing. I have spent 18 years measuring rooms, hospitals, clinics, rehabilitation centers, residential care facilities. Measuring is the foundation of everything I do. You measure before you design. You measure before you build. You measure to confirm that what exists in physical reality corresponds to what exists in your plans, your calculations, your contracts. Measurement is how architecture stays honest. It is how you guarantee that the building will be what you say it is. I know how to measure a room. I have measured thousands of rooms. I have never before encountered a room that measured differently every time I came back to it. Westbrook Psychiatric Hospital contracted our firm to modernize their main day room, the primary social and therapeutic space where patients spent the largest portion of their daily routine. Group therapy, meals, recreational activities, social interaction. A renovation updating lighting systems, HVAC, and furniture configuration for better patient flow. Standard institutional modernization work. My initial site survey was conducted on a Tuesday morning in October. I was thorough and methodical, as I always am. I measured the day room's dimensions using standard professional equipment and confirmed them against the original 1962 architectural drawings. 40 feet by 60 feet, 8 large windows along the south wall, 4 ceiling-mounted fluorescent fixtures. Straightforward. I photographed everything, noted the existing conditions carefully, and went back to the office to begin design development. When I returned 3 weeks later for the detailed measurement phase, the room measured 47 feet by 73 feet. I assumed measurement error. I am a professional, and professionals assume measurement error before they assume anything else. I repeated the process carefully, using different starting points, checking my equipment calibration. Same result, 47 by 73. Nearly 200 additional square feet compared to my initial survey. I checked my original notes. I checked my photographs from the first visit. The photographs were consistent with the original blueprints, 40 by 60 feet, 8 windows. The current measurements were consistent with a different room. I brought my senior designer Patricia Wang for a third measurement session. We used laser distance meters, traditional measuring tapes, and photogrammetry techniques that calculate dimensions from precisely positioned photographic reference points. All methods confirmed the larger dimensions, 47 by 73 feet, 10 windows along the south wall where my initial photographs had clearly captured 8. The blueprints must be inaccurate, Patricia said. Buildings are often modified without updating the drawings. This was reasonable. I proceeded with design development based on the measured dimensions. I scaled our renovation plans to the room as I now understood it. I ordered materials accordingly. I arranged the construction phase kickoff meeting. When I arrived for that meeting, the day room measured 52 feet by 78 feet, 12 windows. I want to pause here and be precise about what I am describing, because I understand how this sounds to anyone who has not stood in that room with a measuring tape in their hands and watched the numbers refuse to make sense. I'm not describing a measurement discrepancy attributable to equipment error. I brought 3 separate laser measuring devices, 2 traditional steel tapes, and a calibrated surveyor's wheel to the construction kickoff meeting. All instruments agreed, 52 by 78, 5 feet longer and 5 feet wider than my most recent measurement. 12 windows where 10 had been 2 weeks prior. No evidence of any construction work having been performed in the interim. I am not describing a perceptual illusion created by lighting or furniture placement. I was measuring from fixed points on structural walls using professional instruments whose accuracy I would stake my professional license on. I am describing a room that was larger every time I came back to it. The construction supervisor was, understandably, losing patience. Materials had been ordered for dimensions that no longer matched the space. Electrical specifications, HVAC calculations, flooring orders, everything required revision. I revised everything. Patricia suggested we establish a monitoring protocol. Weekly measurements, using the same instruments from the same positions, with photographic documentation of the room from consistent angles. If the room was continuing to expand, we needed to understand the rate and develop a renovation strategy that could accommodate it. The weekly measurements, established a pattern that violates the foundational principles of my profession. Week 1, 52 by 78 feet, 12 windows. Week 2, 53 by 79 feet, 12 windows. Week 3, 54 by 81 feet, 13 windows. Week 4, 56 by 82 feet, 13 windows. Approximately 2 feet in each direction per month. Consistently, measurably, documentably expanding. And not only expanding, architectural features were being added to accommodate the larger space. Windows appeared without construction. Lighting fixtures multiplied to maintain appropriate illumination for the growing area. The floor plan was adjusting itself to maintain structural proportions. I contacted structural engineers, building inspectors, surveying specialists. I brought each one to the day room, gave them no context beyond verify these dimensions, and watched them take their measurements independently. All confirmed the current dimensions. None had an explanation for how those dimensions differed from the original blueprints or my earlier surveys. Buildings don't grow, the structural engineer told me, with the particular impatience of someone who has had their professional certainties challenged. You're dealing with measurement error, equipment malfunction, or documentation problems. Meanwhile, hospital staff were reporting experiences that validated what our instruments were capturing. Patients complained that the day room felt different, larger, that it took longer to walk from one end to the other, that the windows seemed farther from the furniture than they used to be. I start walking toward the windows, one patient reportedly told nursing staff, but I never seemed to get there. Night security guards noted the same phenomenon during their rounds. The day room seems larger at night, takes more time to walk through, like the walls moved back when nobody was looking. On December 15th, I conducted an overnight observation session in the day room. I positioned laser measuring equipment at fixed reference points, marked positions on the floor with tape, and sat in the center of the room with a clipboard and a flashlight to document any changes in real time. At 11 p.m., the room measured 69 by 91 feet. At 3 a.m., I repeated the measurements, 71 by 93 feet. The room had grown 2 feet in each direction during 4 hours of my direct, uninterrupted observation. I was watching a room expand, and I could not see it happening. No sound, no movement, no visible physical change, but the instruments did not lie. By 6 a.m., when day shift staff arrived, the day room measured 73 by 95 feet, 18 windows, nearly double the original blueprint dimensions. When I presented these measurements to hospital administration, the administrator looked at me with complete composure and said, "Mr. Stone, our day room has always been this size. The blueprints you're referencing must be for a different building." I checked the architectural drawings. They now showed 73 by 95 feet. My original photographs, the ones from my first survey, the ones I had in my files clearly showing a 40 by 60 foot room with 8 windows, were still there. The physical prints, the digital files, the metadata showing they had been taken at Westbrook on my initial site visit, all still present, still showing a room that was 33 feet shorter and 35 feet narrower than the room that now existed. The renovation was completed at twice the original budget. The day room was finished, functional, and a genuinely improved therapeutic space. Nobody questioned the cost overruns because nobody remembered the room being smaller. I keep the original photographs. I keep every measurement from every site visit, dated and documented in my professional records. Evidence of a renovation project that was charged with improving a room and instead found itself racing to keep up with a room that was improving itself. Some spaces, I have concluded, expand to accommodate what they are used for. Some rooms understand their purpose better than the blueprints that were supposed to define them. And some buildings grow not because of what is done to them, but because of what is needed inside them. I don't know if the day room has continued growing since the renovation was completed, but I think about those patients walking toward windows that kept receding, and I wonder whether the room was expanding for them, whether whatever was adding those windows and those feet of floor space was doing it because the patients inside needed more room to breathe. I hope so. I genuinely hope that's all it was. Story 6. The patient who couldn't live. Successful discharge is the goal. Everything in psychiatric social work, the months of discharge planning, the family therapy sessions, the housing applications and medication schedules, and outpatient referral paperwork, all of it exists in service of that goal. Getting someone to the point where they are stable enough, supported enough, connected enough to the resources they need that they can leave institutional care and resume a life of their own. When a discharge goes well, it looks exactly like what happened with Robert Henley. Robert was 54 years old. He had been admitted in 2016 following a severe manic episode, the kind that results in property damage and emergency psychiatric intervention, the kind that frightens everyone involved, including the person experiencing it. His first 18 months at Riverside were difficult. Medication resistance, frequent mood cycling, periods of deep depression alternating with manic escalation, severe enough to require seclusion. But by late 2018, something started to shift. His medications finally found the right configuration. His mood episodes became less frequent and less severe. He began participating actively in therapy. He talked about the future with something that was not quite optimism, but was at least openness, a willingness to consider that there might be a future worth planning for. I worked with Robert for 6 months preparing for his return to community living. We identified suitable housing. We arranged outpatient mental health services. We coordinated with social services for ongoing support and developed a comprehensive transition plan that addressed every foreseeable challenge. His family, initially hesitant, agreed to provide support during his reintegration. On June 15, 2019, Robert Henley was discharged from Riverside State Hospital. His brother arrived to collect him. Robert packed his belongings, said goodbye to staff and fellow patients with the particular warmth of someone who is genuinely grateful for care that helped him find his way back, and walked out through the main entrance to the parking lot. I watched from my office window. He got into his brother's car. The car drove away. The parking lot was empty. Discharge complete. 3 days later, Night Security Officer Davis stopped me during a shift change to ask if Robert Henley was still a patient. He was discharged Monday. Why? I saw him last night. Main entrance area around midnight. He was still wearing hospital clothes and carrying a packed suitcase. I checked Robert's file. Discharged June 15th, transporting by family member, all paperwork properly completed. I called his brother to verify arrival. Robert was home, settled into his new apartment, doing well. I thanked the officer and filed the report under the category of staff saw someone who resembled a former patient at night, which is easy to do. And I moved on. But Davis kept reporting sightings. Every night, without exception. Robert walking the familiar paths he had walked during his hospitalization, sitting on courtyard benches where he used to spend his afternoons, standing outside the windows of his former room, looking in at whoever was sleeping there now, always carrying the same suitcase, always wearing the same clothes from his discharge day, always at night. Other security staff began corroborating. A second officer described seeing Robert attempting door handles along the main building's east wing. He looks confused about why they won't open, the officer wrote in his incident report. Like he doesn't understand why he can't come back inside. I called his outpatient therapist. She reported that Robert was adjusting exceptionally well. Regular appointments, medication compliance, active participation in his day program. No desire to return to inpatient care. No distress about his transition. She sounded genuinely pleased with his progress. Two concurrent realities. Robert Henley, thriving in his apartment, attending his appointments, building a life. And Robert Henley appearing at Riverside every night, unable to get inside, carrying a suitcase that seemed to contain everything he owned. On July 3rd, I stayed late and positioned myself to observe the courtyard and main entrance. At 11:30 p.m., he appeared, walking slowly along the main pathway, carrying the brown suitcase, wearing the blue shirt and khaki pants from his discharge day, moving with purpose but without apparent destination, following the routes he had taken throughout his 3-year hospitalization, as though the paths were still his. I went outside. "Robert, what are you doing here?" He looked at me with immediate recognition and no surprise at all. "Ms. Martinez, I'm trying to go home, but I think I'm lost." "Robert, you were discharged 2 weeks ago. Your home is your apartment across town. Your brother helped you move in. You've been living there." He looked genuinely confused, not distressed the way he became distressed during manic episodes. Quietly, thoughtfully confused. I remember packing my things. I remember getting ready to leave, but I can't seem to leave. Every time I try to go, I end up back here. I walked with him toward the parking area. As we approached the main entrance, he stopped, as though he had walked into a wall that only he could feel. "I can't go any further," he said. "Something's keeping me here." No physical barriers. No security personnel. Nothing between Robert Henley and the parking lot, but about 15 feet of open walkway. And yet he stood as though he had reached an absolute boundary, a line that his body knew not to cross, even if his mind couldn't explain why. "Would you like me to call your brother?" "I've been trying to call him for weeks, but my phone doesn't work here anymore." He showed me an unremarkable mobile phone. When I tried it, I got no signal, no dial tone, no response from the device despite full signal strength on my own phone standing in the same spot. Robert tried calling his brother's number using my phone. Error messages. Failed connections. As though the act of Robert Henley making contact with his own life was something the night refused to allow. The encounters continued throughout July. I began documenting them. Night nurses saw Robert through windows, trying to enter his former room. Kitchen staff spotted him in the cafeteria area, apparently looking for the meals that used to be served at specific hours. Maintenance workers found him in corridors, walking the routes he had known. Each encounter followed the same pattern. Robert appeared confused about his discharge. He expressed a desire to go home. He was unable to leave hospital property despite nothing physical preventing him. In mid-July, I decided to drive him to his apartment directly. He got into my car without difficulty. He gave me accurate directions. He buckled his seat belt and seemed, sitting in the passenger seat with the familiar streets passing outside the window, like a man on an ordinary errand. But as we drove further from Riverside, his distress grew. He began insisting we were going the wrong direction. He pointed back toward the hospital with increasing urgency. By the halfway point, he was showing signs of acute panic, hyperventilation, perspiration, hands gripping the dashboard edge. "Please take me back. Something's wrong. I don't think I'm supposed to be this far away." I turned around. The moment we re-entered the hospital parking lot, every symptom vanished. He thanked me for the drive. He took his suitcase from the back seat. He walked toward the main building with the calm purpose of someone going home. The next morning, his outpatient therapist called to confirm his 9 a.m. appointment attendance. He was on time, composed, and making excellent progress. I transferred to a different facility 6 months later, but I drive past Riverside occasionally in the evenings, and I have formed a habit I can't seem to stop. I look for him. He is still there. walking the familiar paths with his packed suitcase, perpetually in the process of leaving, never quite completing the journey home. Present in his life during the daylight hours of official documentation and outpatient progress, and present at Riverside during the dark hours when something in him or something in the hospital will not let the discharge fully conclude. Some discharges are successful on paper, but incomplete in reality, and some patients require a different kind of follow-up care. Care that extends beyond community-based treatment plans and official documentation. Care that happens in the space between what is recorded in the morning and what walks the grounds at midnight. I don't know what Robert Henley is. I don't know whether what appears at Riverside is him, or something that was once him, or something wearing the shape of his leaving, as though leaving were a state that certain people can get permanently stuck inside. I only know that he is still trying to go home, and that whatever is keeping him from completing that journey, it's been at it for 5 years, and it shows no sign of stopping. Story 7. End of watch. Security work is documentation work. People don't always understand that. They picture security guards as reactive, responding to incidents, restraining problems, managing crises. And yes, that's part of it. But the foundation of institutional security is the log. The handwritten record, time-stamped and signed, that proves the facility's protective systems are functioning. That someone was there. That someone was watching. For 7 years, I maintained those logs with a professionalism that I took genuine pride in. Each entry precise, each timestamp accurate, each observation objective and clearly expressed. Every round I walked was documented. Every door I checked, every patient area I monitored, every equipment status I verified. My handwriting was consistent. My signatures matched. My records were reliable in the way that I was reliable, completely and without exception. So when additional entries began appearing in my logs, entries documenting rounds I had not walked, patrols I had not conducted, signed with my name but describing activities I had no memory of performing, I knew immediately that something was wrong. I knew because I am a man who knows his own handwriting, and because the entries were signed with a phrase I had never once used in 8 years of security documentation. The first anomalous entry appeared on March 3, 2021. My standard log showed normal hourly rounds from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., each entry properly timed, each appropriately detailed, each signed in my standard format. But at the bottom of the final page, in the margin below my last official entry, was an additional line. 3:47 a.m. final round complete, all areas secure, end of watch, T. Chen. The handwriting was mine. I have looked at enough of my own handwriting to be certain of this. The letter formations, the spacing, the particular way I make my capital A and my lowercase e, all of it matching my documented style. But I had no memory of making a 3:47 a.m. entry. My final round had been completed at 3 a.m. I had gone directly to the security office and remained there until shift change. And end of watch. That phrase had never appeared in my logs in 8 years, not once. My standard closing was round complete or all secure. Never the formal, weighted finality of end of watch, which is the phrase used for a fallen officer. The phrase used when someone's service has concluded permanently. I assumed fatigue. Night shift workers sometimes perform routine tasks in a state of diminished consciousness that produces no clear memory. I had been working long hours. I could have made the entry automatically during an exhausted moment. I believed this for exactly 19 days, until the entries began appearing on nights when I had specifically, carefully documented my whereabouts to the minute. By April, the entries were appearing consistently, always during hours when I was seated at my desk in the security office completing paperwork, always documenting comprehensive patrols of areas I hadn't visited, always signed T. Chen, always concluding, end of watch. And the entries were not vague. They were not the kind of generic, all-clear notation you might produce on autopilot during a foggy-headed moment at 4 in the morning. They were specific, detailed, professionally observed. April 12th, 4:31 a.m. Full building patrol complete. Security systems functioning. All personnel accounted for. End of watch. T. Chen. They mentioned particular patients by room number, noting behavioral states. They documented specific equipment issues, a malfunctioning light fixture, a window latch in need of maintenance, that were accurate when I checked them the following morning, but that I had not personally observed. They recorded the names of staff members who had been working that night, their locations in the facility at specific times, details that required physical presence in those locations to know. I was not in those locations. I have security camera footage proving I was not in those locations. I sat at my desk, reading incident reports and drinking coffee, and something wrote detailed, accurate patrol logs in my handwriting from places I was not. I set up a camera. The footage showed me continuously at my desk. The log showed the additional entry in the 4 a.m. hour, same as every other night. Handwriting identical to mine, accuracy beyond question, memory entirely absent. In May, the entries stopped describing only patient welfare and security systems. They started describing me. May 3rd, 4:17 a.m. Orderly on Ward C showing signs of exhaustion. Patient in room 23 experiencing anxiety episode, monitored until stable. All systems operational. End of watch. T. Chen. I checked on the room 23 patient the following morning. Nursing staff confirmed he'd experienced an anxiety episode during the night requiring additional medication. He had been monitored until stable. Someone had been there. Someone had documented it under my name. When I brought this accumulated evidence to hospital administration, the administrator reviewed several months of logs and told me my performance had been outstanding. Thorough, detailed, comprehensive. Exactly the kind of documentation the institution needed from its security staff. He seemed genuinely puzzled by my objection to being credited with excellent work. But I'm not performing those patrols. Someone else is. Thomas, he said, the handwriting is yours. The signature is yours. The content is accurate. I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I was suggesting that something was using my identity to continue security work that I was not doing. Something that cared, with specific and detailed attention, about the safety of the patients and staff in that building during the hours when I was sitting at my desk. Something that knew what was happening in every corridor and every room at 4 in the morning. On July 15th, my final night at Millfield, I completed my last official security log. Standard entries, standard rounds, standard documentation. Before leaving at shift change, I checked the log one final time. There was a new entry, dated the following shift, the one that would begin after I was gone, the one I would not be present for. 8:00 a.m. Patrol duties transferred, all areas secure, facility protection maintained, final end of watch, T. Chen. Not my shift, not my hours. Written in my handwriting, announcing the transfer of my responsibilities to whoever would come next, assuring the log that the facility would remain protected. I left Millfield that morning and did not go back. But I have thought, many times since, about the officers who continue to document their rounds in the facility's security logs, about the careful, professional, accurate attention being paid to patients who are asleep and vulnerable in the deep hours of the night, about the comfort of knowing that somewhere in that building, after the last authorized guard goes home, someone is still walking the corridors and writing it all down. Some guards take their watch seriously enough that clocking out is the least of their concerns. End of watch is what you say when the service is over. when the last round has been walked, when there is no more ground to cover and no more shift to complete. Some officers, apparently, never reach that point. Story 8. The Mirror Remembers. Mirror therapy has a documented clinical history in psychiatric and neurological care. The technique was first used systematically for phantom limb pain, allowing amputees to perceive movement in a missing limb through the brain's interpretation of reflected movement. In psychiatric contexts, the mirror becomes a tool for grounding, helping patients with dissociation or depersonalization reconnect with their physical presence, using visual feedback to anchor them in embodied reality. The therapy room at Clearwater had a large mirror mounted on the north wall. It had been there for decades. Patient after patient had sat before it and, with clinical guidance, used their own reflection to navigate their way back from the places their minds had taken them. For 3 years, this mirror helped people. In my final year at Clearwater, it started showing me things that I could not explain. Things that had been present all along, I now believe, simply waiting until someone was paying close enough attention to see them. In October 2019, patient Morrison told me that the person in the mirror was not him. This was not unusual. Patients with dissociative disorders frequently experience disturbance when confronted with their own reflection. The mirror can amplify the disconnection they already feel, seeing the face as a stranger's face, recognizing the body as an object rather than a self. I documented his response and continued standard protocols. But Morrison's description was specific in a way that made me write more carefully in my notes that evening. He wasn't saying the reflection didn't look like him. He was saying the reflection knew things he didn't know, that he could see it in the expression, that the person in the mirror was keeping secrets. Over the following weeks, more patients reported similar disturbances. Patient Davis told me her reflection had smiled while she was crying. She had checked by touching her own face. No, she was not smiling. But the reflection held the smile for several additional seconds before matching her actual expression. Patient Williams described something I needed to verify personally before I could record it in any document without feeling professionally dishonest. He said his reflection was moving slightly ahead of him. Not dramatically, half a second, perhaps less, but consistently. His hand rising in the reflection before his hand rose in reality, as though the mirror was showing him something that was about to happen rather than something that was happening. I positioned myself to observe both Williams and his reflection simultaneously during our next session. The discrepancy occurred. I saw it directly. Williams raised his right hand, and the reflection raised its hand first, by a fraction of a second that was nevertheless clearly, observably real. When I looked directly at the mirror, the timing appeared normal. Only in peripheral vision, only when I wasn't looking for it, was the lag visible. I consulted my supervising psychiatrist. He offered the explanations that experienced clinicians offer when their colleagues report perceptual anomalies in clinical settings: suggestion, confirmation bias, fatigue, the human tendency to absorb patients' framings of their own experience and begin perceiving accordingly. I attempted to accept these explanations. I was not able to. On December 3rd, patient Chen told me there was a woman standing behind me in the mirror. Old-fashioned nurse's uniform. She was trying to say something, but Chen couldn't hear her. I looked behind me. The room contained 2 chairs, a small table, and us. I looked at the mirror. I saw my own reflection and Chen's. I saw the chairs, the table, the door. I saw everything that was physically present in the room. I did not see the woman in the old-fashioned nurse's uniform. But Chen's terror was specific and sustained. She described the woman in detail, the cut of the uniform, the way it was belted, the style of the cap. Detail that went beyond what someone invents from anxiety. Detail that had the texture of observation. That evening, I reviewed Clearwater's historical records, looking for something that matched the description Chen had given me without being asked for, without having any means of knowing anything about the hospital's history. Nurse Margaret Stevens, employed at Clearwater from 1967 to 1983, died in 1991. The historical photographs in the archive showed her wearing exactly the style of uniform Chen had described. I do not know how a patient with no access to historical hospital records described a deceased staff member's uniform correctly. I know only that she did. Over subsequent months, patients in the therapy room reported various figures visible in the mirror that were not present in the physical space. Always healthcare workers, always wearing clothing from past decades, always appearing to watch the sessions with the focused attention of clinical observers, always attempting to communicate something that could not be clearly heard. Patients described an elderly doctor who pointed repeatedly at their charts with an expression of concern. A woman in a white coat who shook her head in disagreement at my therapeutic interventions. A group of nurses who observed from the back of the reflection, making notes, conferring quietly with each other. I began documenting their descriptions and cross-referencing them against personnel records. Every figure described matched a documented former Clearwater employee. All deceased. All represented in historical records, available only in administrative archives that patients had no access to. On January 8, 2020, I saw Dr. James Harrison in the mirror. I recognized him from historical photographs I had reviewed in connection with a previous administrative matter. He had been chief of psychiatry at Clearwater from 1971 to 1985. He died in 1994. He appeared in the therapy room mirror with the composed authority of a senior clinician conducting routine observation of a junior colleague's session. He had a clipboard. He was taking notes. His expression as he watched my therapeutic interventions with patient Anderson was thoughtful, evaluative, the expression of someone who is forming professional opinions about the work they are witnessing. I tried to continue the session. Anderson noticed immediately. "You see him too," he said, not as a question. "The man with the clipboard." I couldn't answer that professionally. I ended the session early and sat alone in the therapy room for 15 minutes, looking at a mirror that showed me nothing unusual when I looked directly into it, and showed me a dead psychiatrist when I wasn't trying to see him. I reported the matter to administration with a recommendation that the mirror be inspected for environmental factors affecting visual perception. Maintenance found nothing unusual. The mirror was old, installed in 1965, according to facility records, but structurally sound, properly mounted, showing no optical defects. Then I found the provenance document. The mirror had been donated to Clearwater in 1965 by the family of Dr. Margaret Whitman, the hospital's founding psychiatrist, who had died unexpectedly during the facility's construction phase. She had commissioned the mirror specifically for the therapy room she had designed. It had arrived at a completed hospital that she never lived to use. The dedication plaque had been removed during a renovation, but the original donation record described its intended purpose: to help patients see themselves clearly and find the strength to face their true reflection. Dr. Whitman never used the mirror, but every psychiatrist who came after her did, in a room she had designed with a therapeutic tool she had chosen. And perhaps, I have come to believe, she watched. And perhaps she brought colleagues with her. And perhaps the observation was not passive. Perhaps when the woman shook her head at my interventions, she was right, and I should have listened. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, which I mention because absurdity sometimes accompanies the uncanny, the mirror cracked. No impact, no structural cause, a diagonal fracture extending from upper left to lower right while patient Davis was sitting before it. The crack appeared in the glass as clearly as a struck fault line. but our reflections remained whole. The fracture existed in the physical mirror. The reflected world showed no corresponding division. "All the people behind you are leaving," Davis said quietly. I looked at the mirror in the moment before the crack spread to the edges. I saw them. Multiple figures in the reflection's depth, period clothing from different decades, all turning from their observation positions and moving away through the reflected version of the room. Dr. Harrison was last. He looked directly at me and nodded. A professional courtesy. A colleague acknowledging a colleague. And then the crack spread, and the mirror's reflection was empty of everyone except Davis and me, and the room felt notably different than it had for months. The cracked mirror remains in the therapy room. Administration classified it as a safety hazard too minor to require immediate removal but too significant to continue using for sessions. It sits there, fractured, empty. I pass the room sometimes and look in through the doorway. I have not, since that February morning, seen anything in the mirror that wasn't supposed to be there. But some of the staff members who stop in the doorway, the ones who stand there longer than a passing glance would require, who lean slightly forward before catching themselves, some of them look like they see something. I never ask. Some things are only yours once. Story 9. Room 12, stop calling. The nurse call system is the most important piece of technology in a psychiatric ward's nighttime operation. Stripped of everything else, the monitors, the medication dispensing systems, the electronic health records, what remains essential at 3 in the morning is the simple, mechanical fact of the call button. Patient presses it. Light activates at the nursing station. Nurse responds. The whole system depends on a connection that can be trusted. You see the light blinking, and you know someone needs you. Room 12 at Maplewood began blinking on January 18, 2020, at 11:47 p.m. It has not stopped since. I went to room 12 at the standard response pace. Urgent, but not running, the particular gait that psychiatric nursing teaches you, because running creates alarm and alarm escalates the situations you are trying to contain. I had my medications key, my pen light, the standard equipment for nighttime patient assessment. Room 12 was empty. Not simply unoccupied in the ordinary sense of a patient down the hall getting a glass of water. Empty, stripped. The bed down to the mattress, medical equipment absent, surfaces clean and bare. Prepared for deep cleaning or new occupancy, entirely devoid of the signs that a human being had been living and sleeping and struggling there. The call light continued blinking, both in the room and at the nursing station display panel. I checked the patient roster. Room 12 had been vacant for 2 weeks, since the previous occupant discharged on January 4th. According to hospital records, no patient named Davidson had been admitted during the past month. The man I remembered caring for, his specific responses during medication rounds, his particular way of describing the texture of his depression, the details of our brief conversations about his progress. None of this corresponded to any documented admission. I pressed the call button in the room trying to reset the system. The button clicked. The light continued. I called maintenance. Rodriguez arrived with standard electrical testing equipment and a confident manner that lasted about 20 minutes. He tested the electrical connections and replaced the call button mechanism. The replacement button tested normal. The light resumed blinking the moment he declared the job done. He tried multiple approaches over the following 2 weeks. Different mechanisms, electrical bypasses, temporary system disconnection, physical removal of components. Nothing stopped the light. It blinked from 11:47 p.m. until 6:10 a.m. every night with the steady insistence of someone who has been waiting a long time and has not given up. Eventually, Rodriguez disconnected the electrical power to room 12's call system entirely, removed the wires. left nothing connecting the call button to the nurse's station display. The light continued blinking. "There's no power source for this light," Rodriguez said, sitting in the corridor outside room 12 at midnight with his multimeter and his confusion. "It shouldn't be operating at all." It operated regardless. Patients began reporting the phenomenon in the way that psychiatric patients sometimes report things that staff aren't hearing. Not with alarm, but with a quiet certainty that suggests they are describing something real that they've been observing for a while. "Someone keeps asking for help," patient Williams told me during medication rounds. "The voice comes from the empty room, always asking for help." I told him the room was empty. He looked at me with the particular patience of someone who understands they are seeing something the person they're talking to is not. "I can hear him every night. He calls and calls, but nobody comes." On February 3rd, I spent an entire shift in room 12. I positioned a chair where I could observe the call button mechanism directly. I watched it for 7 hours. At 11:47 p.m., the call light began blinking. The button did not move. No pressure applied, no mechanical trigger engaged. The light activated as though someone had pressed a button that had not been pressed. At 2:30 in the morning, sitting alone in a stripped psychiatric room with only the blinking call light for company, I heard something. Faint, directional, coming from the location where a patient's bed would be positioned if the room had been set up for occupancy. A voice, female, exhausted, with the particular quality of someone who has been saying the same thing for a very long time and hasn't yet decided to stop. "Help me, please." "Hello," I called. "Is someone here?" "Help me, please. I need help." I was alone in the room. I am certain of this. I had been alone in the room for more than 3 hours and had heard nothing. The voice was clear, located, specific, and without a source. It existed in the empty space where a bed should have been from a person who was not there. At 6:10 a.m., the call light went dark. The voice stopped simultaneously. The room was silent and empty and completely ordinary in the flat early light of morning. I reported this to administration. I was told I had been working too many double shifts, that exhaustion-induced auditory hallucinations were common in isolated nighttime environments, that I should take some time off. But other staff members continued hearing the voice. Night orderlies, security guards, cleaning staff who found the locked door of room 12 standing open when they arrived. Patients who had never spoken to me about room 12 before began describing, unprompted, the voice of a man in the empty room who needed help and wasn't getting it. The call light continued blinking every night, regardless of what maintenance did to the system, regardless of whether the call button had a mechanism or a power source or any physical component capable of generating a signal. From 11:47 p.m. to 6:10 a.m., it blinked. And in the deep hours of the night, in the empty room where the bed would have been, someone kept asking for help. I was transferred to day shift on February 20th due to scheduling needs. I could see room 12's call light blinking on the day shift nurse's station display panel. Present even in the daytime now, but dimmer, like something that was more real at night than during hours when the world was paying attention. I have not worked at Maplewood for 3 years, but I think about room 12 at 11:47 p.m. with the mechanical consistency that I still cannot explain. And I think about the voice in the location where a bed should be, asking for a nurse who never comes, pressing a call button that nothing living is pressing. Some patients, I have concluded, cannot discharge themselves from the call system. Some needs are not resolved by the completion of a treatment episode. And somewhere in room 12 at Maplewood, every night, there is a light blinking and a voice asking for help. And it is still not getting an answer. Story 10. The man the MIRS couldn't see. I was a second-year resident when Marcus Webb was brought in. That matters because I want you to understand the context of what I was trained to do and to think. Second year of psychiatric residency is when the clinical certainties start to harden into the shapes they will hold for the rest of your career. You've seen enough to know that most things have explanations. You've developed the professional reflex of reaching for the diagnostic framework before you reach for anything else. Webb was brought in by police on November 12, 2019, following a public disturbance outside the downtown courthouse. He had been screaming about losing himself, claiming that mirrors no longer worked for him. Even that initial description gave me a framework: depersonalization disorder, in which patients feel disconnected from their physical self and may experience their own reflection as unreal or absent. The mirror complaint was unusual but not unprecedented. I proceeded with a standard intake. Webb was 34, an accountant, no prior psychiatric history, no documented substance use, no family history of mental illness. He was articulate, coherent, and genuinely frightened. "Something happened to me 3 days ago," he told me. "I woke up and I couldn't see myself anymore. Not in mirrors, not in windows, not in any reflective surface." I documented this as consistent with severe depersonalization and began standard intake procedures, including routine physical examination in an assessment room with a wall-mounted mirror. During the examination, I looked at the mirror. Marcus Webcast, no reflection. I am going to describe this precisely, because it is the kind of claim that requires precision. I was clearly visible in the mirror. The examination table was visible. The medical equipment was visible. Webb's clothing, resting on the chair where he had placed it, was visible. The room itself, with every piece of furniture and equipment, was reflected normally. Webb's physical body was not. He stood beside the examination table with his back partially toward the mirror, and where his reflection should have appeared, where physics and optics and every principle I had studied since the age of 18 demanded that his reflection must appear, there was nothing. A gap in the reflected world, an absence shaped like a person. I changed his position relative to the mirror 5 times. Different angles, different distances, different lighting configurations. The result was identical in every variation. Marcus Webb, a man I could see directly with my own eyes, a man whose pulse I had taken and whose reflexes I had tested, cast no reflection in any surface. I asked Webb to look at himself in the mirror. He turned toward it with the particular sadness of someone confirming something they had already accepted. "I can't see myself, doctor. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone." I called my supervising physician, Dr. Martinez. His initial expression when I explained why I had summoned him suggested that he was anticipating the particular challenge of managing a stressed resident more than a genuine clinical anomaly. He positioned himself to observe both Webb and the mirror simultaneously. His expression changed. "This has to be some kind of optical illusion," he said, moving around the room, checking the mirror from multiple angles. "Mirrors don't selectively exclude specific objects." We spent 20 minutes in that examination room trying to find the explanation that our training told us must exist. We found none. Over the 3 days of Webb's hospitalization, the phenomenon was witnessed and documented by 12 separate staff members. Nurses, orderlies, security guards, a consulting neurologist, 2 additional psychiatrists summoned specifically to observe and verify. All documented the same thing. Marcus Webb was fully, physically, undeniably present in direct observation and completely absent from every reflective surface in the hospital. We ran comprehensive medical testing. Neurological examination found nothing. Blood chemistry was normal. Ophthalmological consultation found no visual anomaly, that could explain what multiple observers with normal vision were independently witnessing. Webb was, by every clinical measure, a healthy 34-year-old man. A healthy 34-year-old man who did not reflect. Webb's psychological state improved significantly during his hospitalization, for the specific reason that staff members validated his experience rather than dismissing it. He was not delusional. He was accurately reporting a condition that defied medical explanation. Being believed, being genuinely, professionally believed, was itself therapeutic. By November 15th, he was calm, composed, and expressing readiness to return to his life, despite the unchanged nature of his condition. I took comprehensive photographs. Webb in the examination room, Webb in the corridor, Webb beside a window, in every image. His physical presence was captured by the camera, but his reflection, clearly visible in the reflective surfaces in the frame, was absent. The photographs confirmed what every observer had reported directly. On November 15th, Webb was scheduled for discharge. On November 16th, he was gone. Not discharged, not transferred, gone from his room without any documented exit through any monitored point of access. His belongings remained. His discharge paperwork, half completed on my desk, remained. Security footage showed nothing. Administrative records showed no admission for anyone named Marcus Webb at any point during the relevant period. The photographs were gone from the hospital imaging system. My examination notes, my consultation requests, my documentation of the witness accounts from 12 staff members, erased from every official system. Webb's file, his test results, the neurologist's consultation report, gone. And my colleagues, every one of the 12 people who had witnessed the phenomenon, who had stood in that examination room and confirmed what I had confirmed and documented what I had documented, none of them retained any memory of treating a patient with a reflection anomaly. None of them remembered Marcus Webb. I retained my personal notes. Every observation, every detail, every description of what 12 people saw over 3 days, written in my own handwriting in a notebook I kept in my bag rather than filing in the official system. The personal details Webb had provided during his intake assessment led to nothing when investigated afterward. His address did not exist. His employer was not listed in any business directory. His emergency contacts could not be located through any database. Marcus Webb had been as real as any patient I had ever treated for exactly 72 hours. And then he had been as completely gone as his reflection had always been. I have been practicing psychiatry for 4 years since that residency year. I have treated hundreds of patients. I have encountered illness in forms both straightforward and complex, and I have become comfortable with the reality that human consciousness is capable of experiences that we do not yet have adequate language for. But I have not encountered anything like Marcus Webb, a man who was present in every way a person can be present, touchable, audible, clinically measurable, and absent from every surface that shows us what we're supposed to look like. A man who seemed to know, in some way, that his situation was real and documented and witnessed, and who then, along with all evidence of his existence, disappeared as thoroughly as his reflection had always been absent. I keep the notebook, I reread it sometimes. 12 witnesses, 3 days, photographs that should exist but don't. Some conditions affect not just how patients see themselves, but how the world chooses to reflect them back. And some medical cases close not with a discharge note, but with an erasure so complete that only the doctor who treated the patient knows that the space they occupied was ever filled. Story 11. The NAMES of the dead. Seclusion logging is the most legally consequential documentation in psychiatric nursing. I want you to understand the weight of that before I tell you what happened with patient Richardson, because everything that disturbed me about his case was built on a foundation of something sacred to my profession: the mandatory record of a person in crisis. When a patient is placed in seclusion, isolated in a padded room under close monitoring for their own safety or the safety of others, state regulations require documentation every 15 minutes. Not every hour, every 15 minutes. Time, behavioral status, vital signs, interventions attempted. A continuous record that proves, in legal and human terms, that the person confined to that room was never abandoned, that someone was always watching. That care did not stop because the situation became difficult. I had filed hundreds of seclusion logs in 11 years, each one the product of attentive, continuous observation, each one a promise kept to someone who was at their lowest point. On March 8, 2020, we placed patient Richardson in seclusion room 3 following an aggressive episode during group therapy. He was 41 years old, with a long history of schizoaffective disorder, multiple prior hospitalizations, and documented episodes of violence during psychotic decompensation. His current admission had followed a public disturbance involving threats against government officials and claims that federal agents were reading his thoughts. I began his seclusion log at 2:15 p.m. standard entries. Agitated, pacing, refusing verbal interaction. Vital signs elevated but stable, striking the padded walls at intervals, muttering in a way that suggested he was responding to internal stimuli rather than anything in the room. By 4 p.m., something changed. 4:00 p.m. patient appears calmer, ceased pacing, sitting quietly in corner, appears to be listening to something. No obvious external stimuli present. J. Morrison, RN. He had stopped his agitated movement and was sitting with the focused stillness of someone engaged in careful listening, not the vacant stillness of sedation. Active, alert, attending to something I could not hear. When I asked through the observation window what he was listening to, he said, "The names. They're telling me the names." "What names, Mr. Richardson?" He answered clearly, without agitation. He listed them: Margaret Stevens, James Patterson, Dorothy Chen. He said these individuals wanted to make sure he remembered them correctly. These names meant nothing to me. They were not family members he had mentioned during admissions intake. They were not the names of any current or recent patients or staff. They were simply names, offered with the careful attention of someone receiving dictated information and trying to reproduce it accurately. Over the next 4 hours, Richardson continued his recitation. Not frantically, not with the agitated repetition of psychotic ideation, but methodically, carefully, pausing, occasionally asking his invisible informants to repeat something he wasn't sure he'd caught correctly, then proceeding. The list grew. Robert Martinez, Helen Thompson, David Williams. He held each name in his mouth for a moment, checking it before moving on. When I turned the case over to night shift nurse Patricia Wang at 7 p.m., Richardson's seclusion log was standard and complete. Behavioral progression, vital signs, every 15-minute entry accurately documented, signed by me. The following morning, I reviewed the seclusion log before beginning my shift. The log contained my entries through 7 p.m., and then it contained additional entries, continuing through the night, documenting Richardson's condition every 15 minutes as regulations required. The entries were not signed by Patricia Wang. 11:45 p.m., patient resting quietly, vital signs stable, names recitation continues periodically. Sarah Johnson, Michael Davis, Linda Rodriguez, K. Stevens, RN. K. Stevens had transferred to a different facility in 2017, 3 years before Richardson's admission. 12:30 a.m. No change in condition. Patient appears comfortable. No signs of distress. Continues whispering names in organized sequence. K. Stevens, RN. 3:15 a.m. Patient sleeping peacefully. Vital signs normal. When awake, continues reciting names with careful attention to pronunciation. R. Harrison, RN. R. Harrison had died in 2018. I questioned Wang. She was certain she had documented every entry herself. She had no knowledge of anyone named Stevens or Harrison being present in the facility during her shift. When I showed her the log, she was as troubled as I was. The handwriting on the additional entries was not hers, and the signatures were not her name. But the entries were clinically appropriate. Accurate observations of a patient's overnight status, documented with the professional competence of experienced psychiatric nurses. Whatever had produced those entries, it had not made any clinical errors. Over the following days, the pattern of mysterious log entries continued, and so did Richardson's behavior. His name recitation grew more organized. He began listing individuals chronologically in what I eventually realized was the order of their employment at Westfield, starting from the hospital's founding in 1963 and working forward decade by decade. The names were no longer random. They were a roster. I began cross-referencing. I pulled Westfield's personnel records and checked the names Richardson was reciting against the documented history of the facility's staff. Every name matched. Not approximately, not as coincidental phonetic near misses. Every name Richardson recited, the specific first and last names, provided in what turned out to be precise chronological order of their employment start dates, appeared in our personnel files. Staff members spanning 57 years of hospital operation. People who had worked at Westfield for a single year, and people who had devoted careers to the institution. People who had retired, transferred, or died. Richardson, a man admitted for acute paranoid psychosis with no employment history in healthcare, was reciting the complete staff roster of Westfield State Psychiatric Hospital in order. He had no access to personnel records. There was no way he could have obtained this information. But something was giving it to him, clearly and accurately, in a seclusion room with no communication equipment and no human contact beyond nursing staff. On March 15th, Richardson reached the present. He began listing current staff members, not just names, details, years of service, job titles, specific professional information about people he had never met, about roles he had never been told existed. He reached me during my evening monitoring visit. Janet Morrison, charge nurse, 11 years of service, specializes in secure unit management, experienced with seclusion protocols. I stood at the observation window, looking at a man in a padded room who was describing me with the accuracy of someone who had read my personnel file. He moved through the current staff roster with the same methodical care he'd been applying for a week, pausing to ensure each name and detail was correct before proceeding. That night, hospital administration confirmed what I had been piecing together. The names, positions, and service details that Richardson had been reciting for a week corresponded exactly to the comprehensive personnel records spanning every year of Westfield's operation. The seclusion log for that night was signed by a rotating series of former nurses and physicians, people who had worked at Westfield over the past 57 years, all of them long departed, all of them signing with the handwriting and clinical competence they had possessed during their years of service. On March 16th, Richardson was found unresponsive in seclusion room 3. No trauma, no signs of medical emergency that could have been anticipated or intervened upon. His vital signs, documented every 15 minutes through the night by hands that were not Patricia Wang's, had all been normal until they simply stopped. He had died quietly, somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, with no distress and no struggle. The final entry in his seclusion log was in his own handwriting. not the chaotic, pressured script of his psychotic episodes. Clean, composed, the handwriting of someone performing a task they have completed with satisfaction. Day 8, 3:27 a.m. Task completed. All names properly documented for permanent record. Staff roster preservation accomplished. End of assignment. W. Richardson. I've kept Richardson's seclusion log, and the list of names he recited, which I cross-referenced against personnel records so thoroughly that I can confirm with complete professional certainty that he missed no one. Every person who had ever held any position at Westfield State Psychiatric Hospital, from the founding staff of 1963 to the nurse who had started 3 weeks before Richardson's admission, was included, in order, with accurate details, not a single omission. Not a single error. William Richardson died completing a work order that no living person had assigned him. He served as a vessel for an institutional memory that had apparently been looking for someone to carry it. And when the work was done, when every name was spoken and every record preserved, he stopped. I sometimes walk the halls of Westfield and think about all the people whose names Richardson recited. The ones whose faces I know from photographs, the ones I worked alongside for years, the ones who are simply names in a personnel file from decades before I arrived. All of them present in Richardson's voice during his final week. All of them making sure, through whatever channel was available to them, that they would not be forgotten. Some patients, I have come to believe, serve purposes that extend well beyond their individual treatment needs. Some seclusion periods serve as the vessel for work that has been waiting to be completed. And some records are kept by individuals whose qualification for the job has nothing to do with their employment status and everything to do with how much they remember. Story 12. The corridor without end. Ward C's corridor was 200 feet long. I know this because I walked it hundreds of times during my 4 years at Pine Valley. I know the sound it made under my cart's wheels, the particular quality of the institutional lighting at different times of day, the locations of every door and every vent and every water fountain. 200 feet, single hallway, nursing station at the midpoint, exit doors at each end, connecting the east and west wings. I knew that corridor the way you know any space you inhabit daily, not by thinking about it, but by moving through it without needing to think. Automatic, embodied, mine. On February 22nd, 2021, Ward C became something else entirely. I need you to understand the specific quality of the experience I'm about to describe, because it was not the disorientation of a person who is lost, or confused, or ill. It was the disorientation of a person who is completely certain of where they are and where they are going, watching the destination refuse to arrive. Antonio Vasquez and I had coordinating assignments that afternoon. I was transporting medical supplies from the West Wing storage area to the East Wing medication room. Antonio was transporting laundry from the East Wing to the West Wing. We would pass through Ward C simultaneously from opposite ends, meet somewhere near the nursing station midpoint, exchange a few words the way colleagues do when they cross paths, and continue to our respective destinations. This should have taken 7 minutes. I entered from the west end at 2:15 p.m. The corridor looked exactly as it always looked. Patient room doors on both sides, regular spacing, nursing station visible at the midpoint, East Wing door visible beyond it. I began walking at my normal pace. 10 minutes later, I had not reached the nursing station. The corridor extended in front of me, unchanged. Same doors, same lighting, same institutional sameness in every direction. The nursing station appeared to be the same distance from me as when I had entered. I had been walking for 10 minutes in a corridor I could cross in 3, and I had covered no ground at all. I looked back. The West Wing entrance was no longer visible. The corridor extended behind me as far as I could see, identical to what was in front of me, stretching without boundary in both directions. Antonio's voice reached me from ahead. We communicated across the growing distance as we continued walking. He had been in the corridor for approximately 15 minutes and had also failed to reach the midpoint. Neither of us was getting closer to the other despite both of us walking directly toward each other. We agreed to try room doors, access a patient room, get help, break the logic of whatever the corridor was doing. Every door handle on my side of the corridor was immobile. Not locked. Locked doors still yield to a key, still move in the lock, still have the mechanical give of a system that functions. These handles were as rigid as cast iron, as though they were decorative rather than functional, as though the doors had been painted onto the wall. Antonio reported the same experience from his side. We agreed to reverse direction. We turned around simultaneously and walked back the way we had each come. The corridor continued in both directions without resolution. After 30 minutes of walking toward what should have been the entrance I had used, I had still not reached a wall or a door or any boundary. The space had removed the end points. Antonio and I were in Ward C's corridor for what our own watches recorded as more than 3 hours. My watch read 5:47 p.m. when Supervisor Martinez and Security Officer Davis found us. The hospital's clocks showed 2:35 p.m. We had been missing from our duties for 20 minutes. The security footage confirmed this. Both Antonio and I are visible on the recording entering the corridor from opposite ends at 2:15 p.m. We each take a few steps inward. We each stop. We each stand motionless for approximately 20 minutes. We are retrieved at 2:35. We did not walk in that footage. We did not travel through any space. We stood still, within 30 feet of our respective entry points, while our watches recorded 3 hours passing and our memories recorded a corridor that extended without boundary in all directions. But Antonio and I had identical memories of what those 3 hours contained. The walking, the unchanging view, the doors that would not open, each other's voices growing no closer despite continuous motion toward the sound. We compared notes immediately and independently. Our descriptions were precise matches, not the broad strokes of two people who had the same general experience. The specific details, the way the lighting had seemed to subtly intensify near the center of the corridor, the particular echo of our own footsteps, the specific order in which we had tried different approaches to finding an exit. 3 hours of shared experience that the security footage says did not occur. In a corridor that took us nowhere while we walked until we couldn't walk anymore. Martinez reviewed Ward C's maintenance records. No structural changes, no environmental modifications. The footage is definitive, he concluded. Antonio and I had stood still. Our watches were malfunctioning. Our memories were confabulated. I don't argue with that explanation when it is offered to me now. I understand why it is the only explanation that fits within the available evidence. Security footage is reliable. Clock malfunctions happen. The human memory is extraordinarily susceptible to confabulation, particularly in institutional environments where monotony can distort time perception. But Antonio and I both transferred out of Pine Valley within 6 months, citing unrelated reasons, and neither of us has worked in a building with a long central corridor since. And occasionally, in buildings I know well, in hallways I have crossed hundreds of times, I check my watch when I enter and check it again when I exit. Sometimes the numbers match what I expect. Sometimes they don't. And every time they don't, I think about Ward C and a corridor that accommodated whatever duration was needed for something it had decided required our full attention, even if it couldn't tell us what. Some spaces, I have concluded, expand to accommodate whatever cannot be rushed, and some corridors are longer on the inside than any architect intended. I just hope that whatever Pine Valley's Ward C needed us to experience that afternoon, I hope it got what it was looking for. Because I would rather believe it had a purpose than believe, we simply stood still for 20 minutes in an ordinary hallway, while our watches and our memories and our sense of passing time went completely, simultaneously wrong. Story 13. The sessions he can't remember. I have been asked, in the years since I left Riverside, whether I believe the recordings were real, whether the patient was real, whether what I experienced constitutes a genuine encounter with something outside ordinary clinical reality, or whether I was experiencing some form of professional burnout that manifested in a particularly elaborate way. I answer honestly every time. I don't know. I have the recordings. I have watched them enough times to be certain they show me conducting comprehensive, clinically appropriate intake assessments with a patient I cannot identify and do not remember. The technical metadata is authentic. The content is accurate. The clinical relationship visible in the footage shows the natural development of rapport between a psychiatrist and a patient over multiple sessions. I don't know what I was treating. I only know that I was treating it, apparently, for months, and that it needed to be treated, and that whatever decided I was the right clinician for the job did not feel the need to consult me about the arrangement. The recording of the first session appeared in my intake interview folder on April 17, 2021. I discovered it while organizing files for a training curriculum project and assumed it was a misfiled recording from another clinician's sessions. I opened it to identify the case. The footage showed me my consultation room, my chair, my characteristic way of positioning myself at a slight angle to create rapport without direct confrontation, my voice asking standard intake questions, and across from me, a middle-aged man I had never seen before, answering those questions with the composed, thoughtful engagement of someone who had decided to trust the process. The session was 47 minutes long. The timestamp was April 14th. The metadata showed it had been recorded using my login credentials. The session covered everything a proper intake assessment should cover, presenting complaints, psychological history, current symptoms, family psychiatric background, substance use, social and occupational functioning. My clinical questions were appropriate. My follow-up questions showed engagement with the patient's specific responses. My diagnostic impressions at the session's close were reasonable and well supported. I have no memory of April 14th's assessment. I have memories of group therapy that morning, an administrative meeting after lunch, chart reviews in the afternoon, a conversation with a colleague about a shared patient's treatment plan. No gap in my day large enough for a 47-minute intake session I had completely failed to remember. I checked the appointment calendar. Room 3 had been assigned to me that morning for intake interview purposes. No other clinician was authorized to use it during that time. No admission record existed for the patient. No treatment file was opened following the session. No follow-up appointments were scheduled. No medication was prescribed. The patient appeared to have arrived, been assessed comprehensively and competently, and then not existed in any official system. When I showed the recording to Dr. Williams, our clinical director, his assessment of the clinical content was positive. Excellent technique, appropriate structure, solid diagnostic reasoning. He had no explanation for the absence of an admission record or for my lack of memory regarding the session. He suggested clerical error and a follow-up conversation with administration. Administration found no record of the patient, no matching admission from that period, from any facility in the regional psychiatric network. The address the patient had provided during the session did not exist. The employer he mentioned was not registered in any business directory. His family members could not be located. The patient existed in 47 minutes of high-definition, clinical footage, and nowhere else. The second recording appeared on May 15th. Same patient, Same room, same camera angle. A follow-up session I had no memory of, building naturally and competently on the clinical relationship established in the April session. The patient referenced our previous conversation specifically, thanked me for the assessment, noted that my diagnostic impressions had been helpful, described changes in his experience of depersonalization symptoms since we had last spoken. As though a month had passed in a therapeutic relationship that I had no awareness of being part of. Over the following months, recordings continued appearing in my folder on the 15th of each month. Each session built upon the previous one. The therapeutic relationship developed with the natural arc of genuine clinical work. Early sessions establishing safety and history. Middle sessions exploring the deeper patterns beneath the presenting symptoms. Later sessions consolidating insight and developing coping strategies. Each recording showed me doing the work with clinical competence that I was, apparently, capable of while asleep or dissociated or elsewhere, or whatever was actually happening. By September, I had 5 recordings totaling over 4 hours of clinical work. The patient, by the final session, was showing genuine improvement. The depersonalization had reduced in frequency and intensity. His relationship to his own sense of self was healthier. He looked like someone who had benefited from appropriate psychiatric care. I requested transfer to a different facility in October, citing memory concerns that I wanted evaluated. I was given a neurological workup that found nothing. I took the recordings with me. I have watched each one dozens of times. The psychiatrist in that footage is me, my voice, my mannerisms, my clinical approach, my particular way of using silence effectively, and my less effective habit of occasionally leaning forward too quickly when something interests me. All of it is authentically mine. Somewhere, apparently, there is a version of me who conducts monthly sessions with a patient I have no conscious knowledge of, who maintains a therapeutic relationship across months with someone who trusts that version of me enough to do the hard work of genuine clinical change, who shows up for appointments neither of us seems to schedule. And somewhere there is a patient who received care he apparently needed from a psychiatrist who apparently provided it, completely, professionally, effectively, without ever being aware that either of them was doing it. I do not know what to make of this. After 4 years of carrying the question, I have made a kind of peace with not knowing. What I have not made peace with is the end of the final recording. The September session, which appears to be the last, the patient's improvement has reached a plateau that suggests natural termination is appropriate. At the close of the session, the patient stands, thanks me for the care he received, and walks toward the door. He stops at the door, turns back, looks at me, at the camera, at whatever was recording, at whoever or whatever was actually there, with the specific expression of someone who has a question they have not asked before. He starts to say something. The recording ends. I will spend the rest of my career wondering what he was about to say. Some therapeutic relationships, I have concluded, exist in dimensions that conscious clinical practice cannot access. And some patients require treatment that can only be provided by the part of a clinician that operates when the conscious mind is not in the room. I hope the work was good. The recordings suggest it was. And if some part of me knew how to help him in ways the rest of me couldn't manage, well, that seems like something worth being grateful for, even if I'll never understand how. Story 14. The nurse in the corridor. She moved through Cedarbrook like someone who had never forgotten where anything was kept. That was what struck me most in the end. Not the uniform, though the uniform was unmistakably from a different era, white and pristine, and belted in a style that disappeared from nursing practice sometime in the mid-1970s. Not the clipboard she carried, or the precise, purposeful way she navigated the corridors. What struck me was the competence. The absolute confidence of someone who knows this building, these patients, these needs, and has been attending to all of them for longer than any of us has been alive. The reports began in the summer of 2020. Night orderlies seeing an unfamiliar woman in the corridors. Description consistent across multiple independent witnesses. Older woman, late 50s or older. White nursing gown with period styling, clipboard, no visible ID badge, professional demeanor, never moving toward observers, but always moving purposefully toward something. I attributed it to shift change confusion, poor corridor lighting, the human tendency to see professional women as nurses when they're moving through healthcare facilities with intent. I investigated. I found nothing. I increased my own supervisory rounds and saw nothing unusual. On July 18th, I saw her myself. She was standing at the end of Ward A's corridor, outside room 12, examining a patient chart. Not in the way someone looks at a chart they've just picked up in the practiced, quickly synthesizing way of someone who has read many charts and is confirming information they mostly already know. I moved toward her at pace, announcing my presence clearly, intending to verify her credentials and determine her authorization. She looked up, made a brief, final notation on her clipboard, and walked briskly into the stairwell. When I reached the stairwell door, she was gone. Not hurrying away, gone. No sound of footsteps on the stairs, no indication of direction. But outside room 12, on the chart holder I had seen her consulting, there were nursing notes in handwriting I didn't recognize. Detailed, accurate, clinically appropriate observations about the patient inside. Observations that addressed concerns our authorized staff had been working through during the past few days, written with the clarity of someone who had been following the case closely. I spent the following night positioned to observe Ward A continuously. She appeared at 2:47 a.m., emerging from room 8 with her clipboard, moving with the same purposeful composure. I followed her. I watched her stop at room 15, consult her board, make notes while observing the sleeping patient through the door window. I came close enough this time to read what she was writing. The observations were correct. The clinical language was appropriate and current. The recommendations were sound. She was, by every measure of her documentation, a skilled and attentive nurse. When she moved toward the nursing station and I approached from behind, she was gone before I reached it. Her clipboard was on the counter. Comprehensive nursing notes for every patient on Ward A, written in the same neat, professional handwriting, thorough beyond what our scheduled staff had time to produce, accurate beyond what our scheduled staff had had opportunity to observe. And at the bottom, patient Thompson, room 23, critical status anticipated, recommend immediate physician consultation, probable cardiac event within 24 hours, prepare for emergency intervention. Thompson was stable, normal vital signs, no cardiac history, no indicators of the emergency being predicted in these notes. I increased his monitoring as a precautionary measure, documented the recommendation in the official record without noting its source, and notified the on-call physician of the concern. At 4:23 the following morning, patient Thompson experienced sudden cardiac arrest. The emergency response was immediate because we were already watching for it. He survived. He was transferred to intensive care and discharged 6 weeks later. The anonymous clinical documentation continued appearing throughout the summer, always comprehensive, always accurate, always signed with initials that didn't match any current employee, always clinically sound. Security cameras showed nothing unusual during the time frames when the woman was observed by multiple staff members. The footage contained only authorized personnel. The woman in the white nursing gown did not appear on any recording despite having been seen by at least 7 different staff members over several months. On August 15th, I found a note regarding my own professional development. Recommendation for advancement to Assistant Director of Nursing Services, citing specific performance qualities, with the authority of someone whose evaluation I would have taken seriously from any supervisor. The following week, hospital administration approached me about a promotional opportunity. I did not ask how it had come to their attention. I accepted the promotion. In the years since, I have thought often about what it means to be supervised by someone who is no longer officially employed, who is no longer officially alive, someone whose commitment to patient care persisted past every institutional boundary, past employment termination, past the physical limits of a body, past the administrative structures that normally define the scope of a nurse's responsibilities. I researched Sedarbrook's history, the way I think most of us who encountered the figure eventually did. I found photographs of several former nursing staff that matched the descriptions witnesses had provided. One in particular, hired in 1962, worked at Sedarbrook for 22 years, described in her retirement notes as the most dedicated night shift supervisor the facility had ever employed, matched well enough that I stopped looking. Her name is not something I'm going to put in this account. Some things feel like they should be private, like the specific notations she makes on patients who are going to need extra attention tonight, like the particular handwriting on the chart outside a room where something is about to go wrong. Some nurses, I have learned, are not finished when their shift ends. Some forms of dedication find ways to continue that we do not have adequate institutional categories for. I have stopped trying to film her. I have stopped trying to intercept her. I simply read her notes carefully, take her recommendations seriously, and make sure her patients receive the follow-up she has identified they need. It is the professional courtesy she deserves. Story 15, Patient Zero. I want to tell you the last story carefully, because the last story is not like the others. The others are about things that came from outside the ordinary, ghosts, impossibilities, phenomena that exceeded the explanatory frameworks of the people who encountered them. Doors that shouldn't be locked, patients who shouldn't exist, voices from places that shouldn't have voices. This story is different. This story is about the thing that holds all the others together. The thing that makes every hospital, every psychiatric ward, every institution that houses human suffering in its various forms into something slightly more than the sum of its walls and its records and its staff. This story is about the number that never disappears. Ward 3 at Hillview held 32 beds. For 8 years of my tenure as night shift supervisor, the occupied beds corresponded to the patients currently admitted. When I counted 30 rooms with sleeping patients, the census said 30. When I counted 27, it said 27. The documentation reflected reality, which is exactly what documentation is supposed to do. In November 2019, the documentation stopped agreeing with reality. My physical count of occupied rooms, 29. The completed census form, 30. I assumed errors. I double-checked my counts with systematic rigor, marking each room on paper as I passed it, verifying occupancy through direct observation of sleeping patients. The physical count remained consistent at 29. The official form, written in my own hand, showed 30. I brought a second nurse. 2 of us walked Ward 3 together, counting aloud, marking a shared tally, 29 patients. We both wrote the number 29 on our separate tallies. When we transferred that number to the official census form, it showed 30. Not in the printed portion, in the number we had written ourselves, as though the act of completing the form changed the last digit before the ink dried. Administration requested additional verification. I performed the count with 2 nurses present and the administrator observing. 29. The form, 30. One of you is miscounting. the administrator said. None of us was miscounting. We were counting correctly, and the documentation was producing a different number than the one we had produced. In December, I found the source. During late-night rounds, I noticed a room at the beginning of Ward 3's corridor that I had not previously registered as a room. The door was standard institutional construction, properly numbered, room 300, which should not have existed given that Ward 3's numbering began at 301. The room had no corresponding entry on any floor plan, fire safety diagram, or administrative document. It was occupied. An elderly man, perhaps 70 years old, sleeping in a properly equipped patient room. Hospital gown, medical identification bracelet, chart holder on the door. I examined the chart. Patient 0, admitted for census maintenance duties. No discharge date specified. The documentation was comprehensive and professionally written, spanning several years of regular entries. The clinical language was consistent and appropriate, but the content described something that had no framework in standard psychiatric care. The patient's primary function was documented as maintaining accurate facility population counts. His presence was described as ensuring institutional continuity. Under treatment plan, permanent residency status approved. The following morning, I brought Administrator Williams to show him the room. We found a maintenance closet. I returned that evening alone. Room 300 was there. The patient was awake. He looked at me with an expression of profound, patient recognition. Not surprise. The recognition of someone who has been seen before and is glad of it. Supervisor Chen, he said, thank you for conducting accurate census counts. It's important that I'm properly documented. What are your census maintenance duties? I asked. I ensure that hospitals maintain accurate population records, he said, with the calm of someone explaining something he has explained many times to many people who needed to understand it. Sometimes institutions lose track of their residents, forget about individuals who need ongoing care. My presence guarantees that someone is always counted, always remembered. How long have you been here? Since the beginning, he said. Since hospitals started keeping census records, someone has to be patient 0, the baseline count that makes all other numbers meaningful. Before I could ask anything else, I heard the administrator calling my name from the corridor. When I turned, the room was a closet. I was given 2 weeks of administrative leave. Wellness protocol, mandatory review, the institutional response to an employee who has been reporting phenomena that don't appear in any official records. I accepted it. I used the time to think. When I came back, I changed my approach. I stopped reporting. I stopped requesting investigation. I stopped trying to reconcile the official census with the number I physically counted. Every night I write 30. I have written 30 for 4 years now. Whether I count 29 or 28 or 31 occupied beds, I write 30 on the census form, because 30 is the number that appears, and the number that appears is the number that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes, during very quiet nights, the kind of 3 a.m. silence that settles over a psychiatric ward when everyone is finally asleep, and the building is breathing steadily, and you can almost hear the facility thinking, I walk past where room 300 would be, a maintenance closet by every official account. From behind the door, occasionally, I hear the soft scratch of a pen moving across paper. Careful, methodical, unhurried. The sound of someone completing a form with complete attention, not frantically, not desperately, with the composure of someone who has been doing this for a very long time and does not intend to stop. I have come to believe that every hospital has a patient 0, not a ghost in the traditional sense, not someone who died there and is trying to communicate something unfinished, something older and more structural than that, a presence that is woven into the institution's function itself. That exists not in spite of the paperwork and the protocols and the census forms, but because of them, within them, inseparable from the act of recording who is present and who needs care. In psychiatric wards especially, where the line between what is perceived and what is real is already a subject of daily clinical negotiation, the presence of a patient zero makes a particular kind of sense. Someone has to hold the count. Someone has to ensure that the number never reaches zero, that the institution never forgets why it exists. The 30 is always written. The closet is always just a closet, officially. And somewhere in the structure of every hospital where people have been cared for through their worst hours, there is a number on a form that is slightly too high, written in handwriting that everyone insists is their own, accounting for a presence that no camera captures and no floor plan shows. I write 30 every night. I have made my peace with it. Because some patients are never discharged. They remain behind every census, every log, every chart, patient behind the patients, the one who ensures that institutions never lose count of the people they were built to protect. And on the nights when I'm especially tired, and the ward is especially quiet, and the scratch of that pen through the closet door is especially clear, I find it comforting. The count is being kept. Someone is always watching. Even when all of us go home. 15 stories. 15 people who walked into ordinary shifts in facilities built for the most ordinary of human purposes, caring for the sick, keeping records, maintaining safety, completing the paperwork that institutional life demands, and found themselves on the edges of something that their training had no category for. A door that locked itself against opening. 2 men with the same DNA, medical advice from ceiling vents, a shift report signed by a nurse who died in 1990, a room that grew larger every week, a discharged patient who couldn't leave the parking lot, security logs filled in by dead guards, a therapy mirror that showed a 40-year audience, a call button with no electrical connection, a man with no reflection. A patient who recited 57 years of staff names as his final act, a corridor that removed its own exits, a psychiatrist treating a patient he couldn't remember, a nurse making rounds she finished 3 decades ago, and a room that doesn't exist on any floor plan, accounting for the patient who has never been discharged. What are we to make of these accounts? I've read each one carefully, multiple times. I've considered the explanations that exist within ordinary frameworks, stress, fatigue, the particular cognitive vulnerability of people who work in environments defined by altered perception. I've considered that psychiatric facilities attract accounts of strangeness partly because they are already places where reality is being negotiated, where the line between what is experienced and what is happening is already the central question of every shift. And I've considered the possibility that the people who told these stories were simply telling the truth. That some buildings hold on to the people who cared for them. That some forms of dedication, the midnight nurse who won't stop walking her rounds, the security guard who won't stop logging his patrols, the doctor who treats her patients from the other side of whatever door separates us from what comes next, persist past every official terminus. That some institutions become, over time and through accumulated human caring, something more than their blueprints intended. That the census is never quite right because someone is always unaccounted for. Because hospitals, at their core, are places where people come to be seen when they cannot see themselves clearly. And something in the fabric of those buildings, in the floors walked by 10,000 night shifts, in the walls that have absorbed 10,000 moments of human crisis and human compassion, something learns, over time, that the seeing never stops. Not when the shift ends, not when the employment terminates, not even when the person doing the seeing has moved beyond any employment record we know how to file. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in the 13-year night shift nurse who can't stop checking on her patients. I believe in the security guard who writes end of watch and means it as a promise rather than a conclusion. I believe in the elderly man behind the closet door, keeping the census, ensuring the count never reaches zero. I believe in people who cared so completely that caring became the only thing they knew how to be. Whatever they are now, whatever remains in those corridors after the last authorized employee goes home, they were once exactly that. And maybe that is enough to explain everything. This has been Creepyverse. If these stories reached you the way they reached me, if you are thinking about that corridor that stretched forever, or that blinking call light, or the shift report signed by a dead woman's hand, share this with someone who needs to stay up tonight. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment telling me which story you're going to be thinking about at 3 in the morning. And the next time you're in a hospital, any hospital, and the building feels like it's watching you, it probably is. Sleep well.